Try to think of a classically handsome face, and who comes to mind? Or just ask anyone who comes to mind when they think of a handsome man. Brad Pitt would probably top that list, at least in the 90s and early 2000s, and even perhaps still today. But he undoubtedly has the looks as well. I mean, he is just one of those people that can pull off any hairstyle and hair color and just about any piece of clothing, but most people have to consciously select hairstyles, colors that work best for their face, but not Brad. So what makes his face so conventionally attractive and attention-grabbing? In today's video, we're going to break down the science behind Brad Pitt's facial attractiveness, from things as simple as his hairstyle to more complex topics like his facial bone structure, facial dimorphism, proportion, and symmetry. Brad is attractive for the same reason that any beautiful person is attractive. He has a face with high averageness, high sexual dimorphism, high levels of symmetry, and harmonious proportions. It doesn't break the mold of conventionally attractive features looked for in a face as defined by Gillian Rhodes' study on evolutionary attractiveness. Though there are other factors like cultural influences, these four are the main things researchers agree that comprise any attractive face. We're going to mainly focus on two of those four so the video doesn't drag on: averageness and proportion. Keep in mind that there is often an overlap between the other categories as well. As for symmetry, well, anyone with a pair of eyes can see that Brad has an exceptionally symmetrical face, so we're not going to focus on that. But that doesn't explain why Brad Pitt is attractive. We can mainly attribute Brad Pitt's beauty to his pleasantly average facial proportions. After evaluating the bigger concepts of symmetry, facial proportion, and dimorphism, we can still look at some of the smaller aspects of facial beauty, such as hair and youthfulness. So let's delve right into the specifics of why Brad Pitt is classically attractive by Western beauty standards. One of the first things that comes to mind when you think of Brad Pitt is his jawline. It's very characteristic, and his facial structure is very robust. We can tangibly find out why his facial structure is so attractive through facial proportions and landmarks that cosmetic surgeons and orthodontists have been using for centuries to help their patients get a better looking face. To measure the harmony of Brad Pitt's bone structure, we want to first look at his side profile, which is what an orthodontist would typically do. While at first glance he doesn't seem to have the most model-esque side profile, it actually fits most, though not all, of the standards of conventional facial attractiveness that are defined for facial development. He seems to have a normal alignment of the jaw, so no notable overbites or underbites, and that pleasant dentofacial structure is usually one step for an overall attractive facial development. We could go into every single one of these assessments used by orthodontists, laid out by Fort et al. In their study, but for simplicity's sake, let's just get the overarching idea out of the way. The general relationship of Brad Pitt's nose, lips, brow region, and jaw is favorable and attractive, all within adequate forward projection. Neither one is too protruding, nor is it too large, small, or misshapen. This is where all of the cephalometric, meaning measurements of the head, the angles and proportions, come into play. And if you're curious, on screen are some of the noteworthy ones being highlighted and shown. Changing any of these features begins to disharmonize the face, and it would show from the front view as well. As you can see, making his jaw more or less prominent, or his nose, or even his brow ridge, begins to throw off the balance that makes an attractive face. And simply put, he looks less harmonious, if you want to use that word. Actually, harmony can mean proportional and forming a pleasing face as a whole. It's a bit of a difficult word to define. You can use these terms interchangeably to describe Brad's face. He has a balanced, harmonious, and pleasant facial structure. The last point about his bone structure that we shouldn't overlook is that he also has those coveted high cheekbones that are very preferential by Western beauty standards. On top of the bone structure itself, Brad's face just looks like a face that chews a lot. What does that mean? Well, he exercises his jaw muscles just like any other muscles in the body, and he has very robust facial width. And by that, we mean there are 15-minute compilations of Brad just eating in his film roles. It seems that he's found a way to mix his jaw exercises with his work. And the muscle responsible for creating that flared, wide jaw is the masseter muscle. You've probably seen tons of YouTube videos from channels like Brett Maverick that recommend chewing more to grow this muscle and get a wider jaw for men. However, there is a threshold where this muscle can become too developed, leading to an overly boxy appearance of the jaw. Particularly in women, masseter reduction surgery or Botox is actually used to make the jaw harmonize better with the facial structure. We can see how altering Brad's bigonial width, or the jaw width, changes his look completely. Taken to either extreme of too wide or too narrow, it begins to negatively impact his attractiveness. Jung et al. Shows this phenomenon quite well. And in this figure, you can see which jaw width was the most attractive and which was the least. It seems that the middle ground looks the most harmonious. The thing to note is that the images, while rated by both men and women, appear to look more female. The paper notes how factors like age, sex, and culture can influence preferences for specific facial features. Maybe if it were faces with more masculine features being presented, a wider jaw would be preferred. However, conceptually, it is fair to say that this ideal jaw width would still be near the middle ground, as with most human facial features, and in other words, Brad's jaw has high koinophilia, or averageness. It is not too wide, but it also is wide enough to look masculine and powerful, a very healthy middle ground. And this is where sexual dimorphism, the third factor, also comes in. But let's try to stay focused on Brad's facial averageness, or the normalcy of his face. Remember that averageness represents a range of values that can look equally beautiful. It is not about achieving one specific proportion, where some people claim a 1-to-1 ratio of the jaw width to cheekbone looks best, but rather as long as your jaw is not too narrow or wide and it fits within a range of values rather than one specific value, it will look best for your specific facial features. Narrowing Brad's jaw in Photoshop seems to be less impactful to his facial attractiveness than making it look excessively wider, and intuitively this is because he already has a very wide jaw to begin with. Even making it slightly wider makes his face look too full and bloated. Which of these images look more attractive to you? In the original, Brad's jaw is about 91% of his bizygomatic width, or the cheekbone width, and in the after, his jaw is slightly less at 88%. The difference is almost negligible in terms of facial attractiveness because he still has that averageness zone, where he falls within the range of normal values. One such paper by Rayneck and Ferretti discusses clinical soft tissue assessments of facial aesthetics. They note that the jaw width should be 70% of the cheekbone width. Dr. Niney laid out a similar standard in his study as well, though this simply does not play out in reality. You can see that making Brad's jawline that wide does not look as attractive, nor does it in women either. It would be interesting to examine the pool of research behind how they established the ideal, but that is beyond what we're going to be talking about in this video. The paper does note that the height of the face divided by the width should be about 1.35 for a male, and this does seem to align more with the concept of averageness, where Brad's face has precisely that ratio and his face does not appear too long or too short. Altering his facial height or width begins to stray from the middle ground and makes him less attractive. In other words, if his face becomes longer, the ratio will start to skew upwards of 1.4. If his face becomes more compact, the ratio will skew lower than 1.3. And you can see how Brad's face begins to look less harmonious or mathematically average on either end of the spectrum. Moving on to the eyes, Brad Pitt has the perma-squinty model-esque look. That's the actual scientific term, don't quote me on that. His small almond-shaped eyes certainly contribute to the appearance. And while larger shaped eyes appear to be more attractive in women, that is not the case in men because they tend to make a face look submissive, at least according to multiple papers by Keating. Brad's smaller eyes make him look more dominant and attractive, but at the same time, they are not overly small where they disharmonize with his facial structure. In general, Brad looks more like the mature face on the right of this figure, with a more angular jaw and smaller eyes. If we were to make his eyes larger in Photoshop, this would impact how dominant and attractive he appears. So what about the shape and angle of the eyes? Surely that also adds to his attractiveness, and indeed it does. Brad seems to fit most conventional Caucasian standards of attractiveness for the eyes laid out by Wu et al. Without getting too technical, we'll look at the lateral canthal tilt and the medial canthal angle, two of those measurements abbreviated as LCT and MCA. If you're confused, these images will show you what we're looking at. And in that paper, the attractive Caucasian face had more upturned eyes with a tilt of around 7 degrees as opposed to the average attractive Caucasian with 4 degrees. Brad is right in the middle, and the angle made by the inner eye corner, or the MCA, is about 31 degrees. It seems like the more attractive faces had more acute angles like Brad Pitt, or simply put, sharper inner eye corners. Interesting. And to make this even clearer, if we play around with these parameters, we have a hit to his overall attractiveness. We can change the tilt of his eyes in Photoshop to be either more upturned and cat-like or droopy and tired looking. It seems to look best around his normal eye tilt, which aligns with the research that we just spoke about. We can also make his inner eye corner more or less sharp, which also affects his look. Alright, so let's round out the discussion by talking about skin, hair, and youthfulness. Most people acknowledge that being youthful is super important when it comes to looking attractive. That is simply the way it is. But depending on the research you're looking at, peak fertility for men and women is generally at or below 30 years old, and it's not surprising that this is around when we tend to look our most attractive. However, Brad has not really suffered from the deleterious effects of aging. Yes, he is arguably less attractive at 59, but he still retains the backbone of his facial attractiveness from the things we just covered, like proportion and sexual dimorphism. The reason for this is because his attractiveness comes from the bone structure, which doesn't age as much. I mean, bone is solid, doesn't sag like soft tissue and facial fat does. And so having strong bone structure is a key to aging gracefully and having the same face that you had in your 20s, just a bit more wrinkly and aged. Losing the youthful features of vibrant, healthy hair and homogeneous, lustrous skin is an underlying rule of nature that everyone has to go through. However, Brad's foundation of attractiveness through his bone structure makes him retain his beauty almost effortlessly. He is indeed aging like everyone else, but he looked better in his 20s and 30s than he will at 65. However, the thing that made Brad Pitt stand out attractive in the first place was not his youthfulness, it was every other facial feature that we touched on, from dimorphism, proportion, and obviously the sharpness of his features. An individual that does not have the same robust bone structure or the sexual dimorphism and harmony has to rely on their youth as the focal point of their beauty, and this is crucial for why faces like Mads Mikkelsen and Brad Pitt age so well. For Brad, it's just a bonus. At the same time, let's not detract from how well he has maintained the youthfulness of his skin and hair, which is obviously the celebrity money coming in, but that likely has to do with a combination of genetics, healthy diet, and being physically fit as well, and other potential regimens like expensive skincare and Botox. One of the key reasons why Brad Pitt can pull off any hairstyle is because of his facial proportions and masculinity, not his youth. Even approaching 60, he pulls off different looks with ease, and we talked about his face shape not being too long or short, and thus he doesn't have to sport any specific hairstyle to give the illusion of a better facial shape. And so with that, we pretty much cover what makes Brad Pitt attractive. Comment on any of the faces you would like to see analyzed in this series, as we're going to be doing more celebrity analysis videos in the coming months. If you'd like to get your face assessed with an analysis or an assessment, just like we broke it down here, but in much more depth and detail, to learn about your facial features or just look different, you can head over to the QOVES website and get an assessment by a team of doctors and dentists. As always, I'll catch you all in the next one.